Thank you, Yusuf and Michael. It's good to see you always. And it's really a privilege to be part of this conversation because it's an important one. There was a time when I would start conversations about my life and who I am and where I'm from by my hometown or my military service. And I've come over the years to appreciate history in a way that I first position myself relative to history because it's important for me and my family to see ourselves in history. And so I traced my roots back to Nigeria, and I was glad to have a place to call where that tree is rooted, because that would inform a lot of everything else that would happen subsequent to that. My family largely stayed in the South Carolina area for the most part. I bring that up only because that's where my grandfather came to understand what it meant to be a man, to work hard and to do all the things for your family that put them in the best position to thrive. And he did that with the Great Migration, when everybody, left the South to go north and look for opportunities. And that's where he settled in Buffalo, New York, where he raised my mother and her two sisters, who eventually, brought me into this world. And that's where I'm rooted on the other side of the ocean, in Buffalo, New York, where I learned everything there was about being a man from him. My father was killed by a police officer when I was very young, so he was the main role model in my life. And I joined the military because he served in the Korean War. And that launched into my career in the Marine Corps for 12 years, where I went from private to Chief Warrant Officer, which is a commission, folks who might not be familiar with the rank structure. And I did a lot of work for which I'm proud. Fortunately, a crash within my career after 12 years and a period of recovery that went about 2 years led to really me finding my voice in advocacy. That really did it because I was at that low moment. And when I saw the importance of speaking up for myself, it's sort of within that contextual framework that I've always advocated for people who felt voiceless and didn't feel like they were seen in systems. So that really gave energy to this focus on advocacy for veterans, because I am a veteran, but I also know that there are many intersections that happen in uniform. Being a Black veteran, being a disabled veteran, being a woman veteran, a veteran who's gay, or all the other ways that we come into this life. That uniform doesn't cover up everything, and it's not a passport to freedom. In most cases, sometimes it's about the individual having a voice him or herself without the uniform. So, but that's what got me to Capitol Hill, the White House, the VA Central Office Building, to do a lot of the work in speaking truth to power on issues like preventing veteran suicide and enhancing support for the families of people and the caregivers and the survivors, the people who survive the veteran's life. They're a big part of why we have a robust and strong military. So it's important to pay attention to those areas. And then lastly, at this part of my career, I've focused on breaking stigma around mental illness more than anything, because it leads to so many other things that happen to people, which is why I'm working at the National Alliance on Mental Illness right now as a senior executive. But that's been largely my focus over the last year. Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of advice that I usually give to young men and young women in some cases, who are the young lions who are coming up. I always tell them, be careful of an old man in a profession where men usually die young, right? Because there's something about survival, and not just survival, but growth, right? When I was a drill instructor, I was 25 years old and didn't know anything. I knew how to move people, which became important later on, but that couldn't be the only ingredient in the mix. I've been blessed with a number of opportunities to lead people in highly consequential ways while serving in uniform and after separating from the military. One thing I've learned is while most people or many people will make management synonymous with leadership, they're different. One is a function within an organizational structure. The leadership doesn't care about titles. It's about the ability to move people. And that's important because a lot of folks associate leadership with something given to you by a structure, and that's not the way it works. These are lessons I take from making a lot of mistakes in assuming in the wrong way that your title matters when it comes to moving people, but it really doesn't. But there's something else that's probably even more important. Leadership is about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is what happens when you lead by example and engage in constant self-reflection. These are uncomfortable things to do to yourself. I also learned early that arrogance and self-awareness rarely go hand in hand. And so that reflection is an important aspect of being a leader. And sometimes it can feel like when you're holding yourself accountable, you're slapping yourself in the face multiple times, especially when the stakes were high and the consequences were critical, and your life and your decision-making affected lives. But that's how great leaders are created and create other great leaders, by illustrating what that means, that self-accountability means. But I've always said at the end of the day, you end up with two kinds of leaders: the kind who bring happiness with their presence, or the kind that leave happiness behind when they leave, right? Mm-hmm. And I've always wanted to be the kind of leader who, when I come in, I make a situation better, not worse. And when I leave, I don't necessarily want it to, get better in my absence, but I want to leave something behind for the next person who's going to take what I did and elevate it. Which is really the only point of leadership is to make things better in a situation and leave it better than you found it, and set it up for the next individual to do the same thing.
No, man, as you're talking, I'm sitting here and ever since I met you and understood the work that you were doing, I hated politics. Military guys, we just about getting the mission done. So we don't really get into the whole, political realm. But, I think what you have highlighted for me as like you said, the young generation coming up, is that's just something that you're going to have to carry, and that baton at some point is going to be transferred from you to young guys like myself and Michael, to get up and do something. And, over the last 2 years of meeting you, I could definitely say that, I've gotten more involved in advocacy around, of course, veteran is my point of entry of always, but, really start to, flush that out in this health disparity area that we're going to talk about in a little bit later. But just from watching you and what you've been able to accomplish, and like you said, move people and get things done. I've now joined certain organizations that are, bipartisan and speak on certain issues like mental health. My history, that's where I really wanted to bring my expertise to the table as a young Black scientist with some FDA background. And then it all just started coming together. Then start looking at policy, and then policy starts driving me to look at advocacy. And so, I really definitely, you have been one of the, true mentors that kind of I've watched in the space in order to kind of hone in on my craft. You do things a lot different, on the Hill than I do, but, my healthcare area, I figured I'll bring the rear up and help out with the science.
Well, it's, the battle is multifaceted, and you need to have tanks, airplanes, and small arms. No one thing is going to do it. So
absolutely. So I figured out where my niche is, and so I always remember I was like, all right, I think I have a little bit of expertise to add to finally meet with you and Sharisa that day. You had served over 20 plus years in the military, Sharisa being the chief medical executive. And so, it was, that was a enlightening moment for me of looking at what you just talked about, looking at, the folks that have been championing a lot of these advocacy for our vets. And, at some point, I got to get in the game in order to be ready to take the mantle and the baton when that's passed off.
And I'll just say this because, can I mention real quickly, Michael, that when you talk about partisanship, it's really important hone in on that. You can't create the conditions under which you operate in most cases, and you still have to get things done. And your philosophy may differ from somebody else's, but when you understand power, power likes to take credit for making great things happen. And if there's one consistency between the President Obama and President Trump administrations, is they both wanted to be successful and take credit for making great things happen. And if we are functions of that, then the real challenge is to figure out where those interests intersect. You know, what overlapping interests do we have, regardless of political persuasion? And veterans in that space, it's real easy because nobody opposes veterans generally. And everybody wants to take credit for what happens. And then the question becomes, what does it look like? That's all that matters. What does it look like? You know, if we resolve Agent Orange for Blue Water Navy veterans, you know, both parties wanted to do that, but only one was able to do it because, if nothing else, just to make the other party look bad. Well, we'll take that. If you're doing it just to make the other side look bad, which is what veterans issues end up becoming a matter of, then we'll take that. You know, make the other side look bad. Just do your damn job, right? And we'll do that all day.
Awesome. So I think you were part of both the Choice Act under the Obama administration going through and the Mission Act under the Trump administration going through. Anything that stood out to you as different, or if you also want to call out things that were the same under both scenarios, because those are landmark legislation that you were part of making sure got across the finish line.
Well, see, this is I guess the good and the bad. The pro and the con of being in the mix is that you know the real narrative, and then you see what everybody believes. And so Phoenix was where the bottom fell out in many ways, and what led to the Choice Act even becoming necessary. But those are problems that perpetuated for years. I mean, we had done site visits at Phoenix and talked about lack of clinical space and bottlenecks in appointments and things like that. So when that bottom fell out and the Choice Act was written, a lot of it was written on the fly. I was asking questions like, you have specialized care systems. How will those systems be included in expanding care to the community sector? You know, if veterans have a choice, does an amputee, to somebody with spinal cord injury, somebody with unique needs, you know, multiple conditions, who really can't find the level of care out in the community, does choice mean that you're now going to shift some of those resources to this pot of private sector money? And nobody really thought about that. I mean, I remember speaking directly to the secretary and the immediate staff about that specific issue when choice was being thrown together. Now it had to happen, but there were a lot of lessons learned from choice that ended up informing how the VA Mission Act came together. For one, they brought in some great talent, Bali Yahia, Cameron Matthews. I mean, they were bringing in stars who were taking the lead on a lot of this. And in many cases, they didn't have all the answers they needed, but they listened. That's what I most appreciated. Even you, Michael. I mean, there were a lot of people in the room that I didn't see before that were in the room and being a part of conversations. And I felt like I was among people who we could do something with the second time around with the VA Mission Act. But choice was, you know, the immediate aftermath of a lot of bad press around Phoenix. So I didn't have a lot of high hopes for it because I don't feel like the Congress was doing it to fix the problem. They were doing it to put a Band-Aid on the issue and stop the bleeding, I guess is the best way to put it, because it was getting worse. I mean, they were uncovering issues around the country that any one of them could have been Phoenix by itself. And frankly, you know, the leadership at that time, the undersecretary, I won't say his name, but leading up to that, he was not a good leader at all. And I said that to his face many times. So, but
I trust you did. You're definitely a great example of speaking truth to power.
You know, I'm throwing out a lot of quotes. There's one I like. Truth will get you in trouble when the lie is policy, right? And sometimes you speak truth to power and you become ostracized. And under that administration, in many ways, I was ostracized for being vocal. But I was validated in the end by what would eventually evolve into a situation where I was a part of those important conversations when the Mission Act was being brought together because I was a credible voice. the first time around. It wasn't about partisanship and all those things. So that gave me a little cred, I guess, and why I was able to contribute to discussions about how we ensure veterans with unique needs, women and all the other special populations don't get lost in discussions around expanding care in the community.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. It's why we are so humbled and honored that you agreed to join our Impact Advisory Board. It's why we're having this conversation. And I think to kind of tie it into some of what Yusuf highlighted around healthcare disparities, or really the mission of Indigenous health, what I'm going to do is I'll show you a slide and just get your reaction to it. And then we'll use that to really drive the next segment of our discussion. So, Yusuf can do the question prompt, but I think the slide it's really just saying, you look at this slide, you see the headline. It's really just asking a question of, what when you see this, what does it tell you? How does it make you feel? What is your reaction to this information about the lack of diversity in the data sets that are being used for really much drug discovery and research?
Yeah, I would say disappointed, but not surprised, mainly because I know history and the power of social structuring based on class, in this case, ethnicity. And, I won't get too into it except to say that, when you observe a history of the use of genocide, religion, assimilation, and other things as tools to obfuscate culture, create divisions, socio-political divisions, and recast narratives to cover blemishes that many want to deny. And when I say cover blemishes, historical blemishes, this is what you end up with. This has all led to a decentering of people whose roots go back to the continent for all the reasons I just described. And this shows up in education, healthcare, research, and important aspects of social class, where survival of the fittest often comes down to strength in numbers and what gets passed down to each subsequent generation to ensure survival, right? Our DNA. And the more we discover about it, the more empowering it is. But I'm going to also say that the problem is also self-inflicted, because people who have become accustomed to living under oppression end up unwittingly perpetuating the conditions that lead to it by refusing to participate in clinical trials, in part due to an understandable mistrust of oppressive systems. But it's also a long-term consequence of what I call the colonization of the imagination that is designed to keep counterculture in check. We saw this after the Civil War with the historical revisionism that happened and all the opposition to critical race theory. All these together in aggregate is how you end up with these kind of disparities. And then if you can convince everybody that we're all equal without paying attention to these types of things, the social structure absorbs you, uses it for what it needs, right? So you'll have some people in clinical trials that are people of color, but it's not for people of color. It's usually incidental, or you just happen to be involved. And they leave you with not a lot left over, no philosophy, memory, or desire to center your own life. So I'm not going to put this on a social structure too much. I'm going to say that people simply need to be more aware of these types of disparities. People who would benefit by their participation need to be aware, and then decide what's most important. The relative comfort they enjoy of not having to throw themselves into these systems and not being a part of it, or investing through efforts like the one that Indigenous is undertaking, so that we do have the representation we need, not just for ourselves, but for our future generations. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it made me think of a whole lot of things in these numbers that won't get borne out unless you associate it with something, a narrative where these static numbers are not by mistake in many cases, I believe. But they're also a consequence of some of us not realizing how we contribute to the disparity.
And I think you bring up so many great points. I'll throw in a couple of comments. I know Yusuf has a lot of comments. I'll do mine quickly. But you bring up a lot of great points. And one of those points, first that I'd like to push back on was, maybe you said something about maybe we're not a part of it. So we are a part of it. We're just not a part of it on the front end. Because when these drugs come to market, when these medications come to market, when these therapies come to market, and we're not part of the front end of the research, where they're not part of the testing, when they're on the market, they know it works for people with European ancestry. We don't know if it works for us, for the most part. And so we're just taking them. And so that's when we end up being part of the research, because that's when they discover, oh, by the way, there's an adverse drug event, or this is not actually effective, or we just discovered some new side effects. And so the challenge for us is really understanding the dynamic of we are part of it. And we can either be part of it in a way that benefits us as a community, or we can keep doing what we're doing, which is not participating in a meaningful way. And so the other side of where I come in and support what you said is really there are systems in place that make it hard for certain people to do certain things. So we can look at voting and say, oh, people aren't voting. Well, yes, because there's maybe one place for 1 million people to vote in a certain community, and there's thousands of places for people to vote in other communities. In a similar way, clinical trial sites, this is what's interesting about science, right? In as much as people want to use opinion to debate systemic racism, I love science, I love data, because you can't argue with the numbers. They are what they are, number one. Number two, to the point of clinical trial participation, you may not know this, but clinical trial sites in the United States exist in only 2% of the zip codes in the United States. So it will be really hard if your clinical trial is at Stanford, where I went to do my MBA, and you live somewhere that's not Stanford, and you have to take public transportation. You're not going to enroll in that. It's just hard. And so when things are structurally put in place to make it hard for people to do things, it's pretty much telling you you're not wanted. And if people get the flashing signs, you're not wanted, they're not going to want to participate. So what we're really doing is figuring out how we can engage our community and let them know that they're wanted, and let them know that they are a priority. We're not going to be like folks who are literally just trying to use African ancestry data to support therapeutic areas that primarily affect people of European ancestry. We're building this primarily with people of color in mind, primarily with Black and brown people in mind. And that's what we're about. And we're going to make sure we stick with our mission all the way to the end. I'll hand it over to my boss to share his comments, because I feel like I've said a lot.
No, look, all good points. And again, I think, what you see here is just looking through the lens of how each individual here on this phone have received that healthcare, right? And how we've looked at the healthcare system. So, I'm an immigrant from Jamaica. So I landed here 92, 93. And so I've really been, I was pure bright-eyed, bushy tail when I landed with my suitcase, and now I've been completely adulterated over the last 25, 26 years of just looking at a healthcare system, which you could call tears, right? Being an immigrant, that was the urgent clinics, that didn't have a lot of healthcare. So I've actually, when I look at my life in the course of when I came to the States, I kind of moved through different health systems based on my socioeconomic status. While even small, being an immigrant, when I got here, I never knew going to a primary care doctor, right? It was like urgent care, everything's urgent. And then I graduated, joined the military at 17, and then I got into something that was a little better. I was like, oh, wow, this is different type of healthcare. And so, I think over my years, I've been morphed into what I am today, which has been in healthcare for over 25 years. But I've seen where some of these disparities and some of these roadblocks that you guys are mentioning, all the way up to policy, right? I worked at the FDA when I got out of undergrad from Howard. And so, that gave me the lens of looking at how, like Michael just mentioned, that, these clinical research centers were kind of far And then I'm like, why are all the Black people going to do the studies? It can't just be from the Tuskegee trial. And
Nope.
then I started seeing, food insecurity. Folks, you're not going to be able to go give blood if you hadn't ate breakfast this morning. Little things like that.
Little practical things.
But I think what was very astonishing to me, because of my military background, I worked in the Mount Sinai's, the big beasts of healthcare and research institutions, and, the disparities just on not having enough Black and brown people in those research cohorts, these R1 grants, that's what, 500,000, under 750,000. They don't seem to make their way to the Black PhD students that want to fight diversity in the inner cities. Their application don't even make it to the second round of rating. And so, I think last year was really kind of poignant for me when we did the MIT Hacking Racism in Healthcare, where MIT called, and I was like, are you sure you guys called the right person? But, it was invigorating to see the level of interest. We had over 1,000 people, Black and brown, historically Black college, like really roll their sleeve up, and we got some really interesting insight, because that's where you're gonna see it. I think why, I've been quite, effective, at least able to add a little bit of expertise to certain areas, is because I've gone through it. I think there's a level of going through these health systems that then gets me that the obvious conversation with the intellectual capability and being able and worked in certain areas to kind of see the policy side of how things are not set up for us in these communities. The reason why, Howard, which is a tier 1 research institution, just like Johns Hopkins, only got $40 million in research funding, and Hopkins gets $1 billion a year. Like, I'm trying to figure out how the math works, right? So it's, what I think, has been a unique piece for me is the hybrid that I bring to the table, where I understand the policy, but I also have gone through a healthcare system paradigm that you automatically see the structural, racism that's been built in, the lack of economic power in certain healthcare areas that we're looking at here on the slide. And so, what brought it home for me, I had a large study that we were looking to approve a product, and it had quite a large amount of dropouts. And so being inquisitive, one day I was just tired of looking at and just brushing past it, right? And one day I was like, you know what? Can you send me the names of these people that dropped out? Wow. Mind blowing. Exactly what we're talking about today. Women, minorities, and, interesting to say, as I started to look at those addresses, it all made sense to me. These were folks that were like, look, I'd love to participate. So it then brought me to say, well, it's not that we're all saying, look, research is bad. And, we have that historical pain that we've gone through. It's just that people can't get to the damn trial site and can't eat breakfast before they go give, a 10 ml of blood, which is, they'll faint, they'll pass out. And so these are some of the areas that, again, I think Indigenous health is highlighting, and, we're going to get into these inner city communities, and we're going to have to set up these community-based trial centers that addresses the same way, again, why is it that we're in the 21st century and we're still administering clinical trials only in English?
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to the structure, right? It's like, you're not wanted is basically the gist of it. And ultimately, this is where technology comes in, because now you can do hybrid clinical trials, right? You can basically go into these communities. So then the question becomes, when the technology is available and they're still not adopting it, what does that tell you? And then to the point that, because words matter, right? So in the United States, we've been conditioned to say minorities. When you look at this map, when you look at this table, there is a minority on the chart, and it's not people of African ancestry. And these are just the facts.
Right.
But when we're conditioned to think and feel a certain way, this ultimately ends up being the result. And so for us, we almost have to rise above and really look at what's going on and understand the power we all have as a community within ourselves here in the United States and across the diaspora. And before we go to the next question, really dive into the question of funding, wanted to get Sherman's thoughts on sort of the ancestry piece you brought on when you were talking about your background. So you said you traced your roots back to Nigeria, which is sort of where I was born. But what I will give you context on is Nigeria was created by the British in 1914, right? A function of their colonial ambitions on the continent. And so what they actually did, and I don't know if you're able to get down to the nitty gritty of what tribe you're from, but I'm from the Yoruba tribe originally. And what they did, like other conquering nations did, was they designed what they left behind to be dysfunctional. So they fundamentally took a piece of Yoruba land and put it in Nigeria, took another piece, put it in Benin Republic, took another piece, put it in Togo. And it's because they were splitting it up with the French, right? So they set it up. And so now you're saying they took hundreds of years of history and then they mashed us up with a tribe we've been warring with in the north, which is basically I won't mention the names, they know who they are, and a bunch of folks we've been warring with in the east. Then they put it together and said, hey, go forward, be a country. And so I'm sitting there going, what if someone took Afghanistan, Turkey, and Texas, mashed it together and said, y'all be a country? So, some structural things will be making it a challenge to actually create a functioning, united enterprise. And so when people criticize sort of where Africa is or what's going on in Africa, I always say, go look at the design. And so I don't know if you're able to get into what tribe you're from, but you're a brother to me anyways, because, you claim Nigeria. Yusuf, I know you were born in Jamaica. We're gonna find out.
I don't think I could get to the details, and it's not for want of doing so. I mean, I really wanted to pinpoint. What's interesting, Michael, is you talk about that narrative. What I didn't mention is that 13% British blood that shows up in my DNA. That most of that 85% West African, but that little piece, and and that's reflected in a lot of our faces. Those of us who are here and don't really have the historical context of our origins. I have a family tree that looks like the United Nations because of all the things that history has recorded that has happened. I mean, you can look at census records where the individual who's in my bloodline was a housekeeper, and the head of the household was a male with a wife and kids. Well, how did that jump happen from that head of household to the housekeeper, who happened to be mulatto or Negro or whatever the census record said, never married, never really connected to the family, except, and that's how you end up with a DNA readout that where you have Nigeria and Britain in the same space. And, I heard one of my aunts refer to it as having rape-colored skin, because, you can't explain how you end up with this type of profile without appreciating the history of how that profile came to be. So, but that's, and it's not to identify a boogeyman. I mean, that's what happened. And like you said before, the facts are the facts. That's just how things happened. And so we have to digest that and give it meaning. And the way I give it meaning is to use what my DNA tells me, to do exactly what you did for me, inform myself and go deeper than, okay, there's Nigeria, but what about Texas, Afghanistan, and Turkey? I mean, what is it about what happens and why? Well, maybe it's easier to, develop a slave economy when you have the people who are providing it look like the people who are enslaved. And the more you can do that, the more you ensure yourself a supply chain, right? So there may be a motive I don't know if that's the history, but I would imagine that it benefited some folks who saw the economy in the slave trade and decided if we can foment division, that assures us a supply line, and we don't have to go in and do the work. You know, they're going to give it to us. So it's a complicated history. Very complicated.
That is literally what happened. And you know, when I look back, and I know it's not about me, but you sort of opened the door, so I'm going to step in a little bit. And so some of the context there was, yeah, slavery has always existed, right? And what really happened in the context of Africa, or in the context of the area that's currently called Nigeria, is ultimately, once the slave trade really kicked off, folks that used to just casually sell their prisoners of war into the transatlantic slave trade now said, hey, I can actually just go fight and capture some people, because now there's a market to sell it into. And so ultimately that demand drove a lot of what then transpired, which just led to a lot more conflict. And so when you're fighting each other, you're never going to have a chance to actually build for the future. And so when you design something to fundamentally create division, to fundamentally create conflict, that is one of the early signals of something that's going to be in decline. And so history has shown us this, right? You know, united we stand, divided we fall. And so when you create something that's fundamentally divided, it's really challenging to actually take forward.
And can I build on that point you just made, Michael? And race is a social construct. There was no idea of being Black back then. So there was no we. It was, we're Africa, you know, we may be Africa. I'm not even sure if they even saw that as a name of this land at that time. They had their own, you know, geographical demarcations of land and all those things. What we're seeing today is not that. But there was no idea of a we. You had your tribe. You know, it was your tribe. And you know, and by the way, this was happening in England. The medieval period was bad for people who happened to be white. They weren't treating each other very well. So that's how the world operated back then. Native Americans and all those people in other parts of the country, there was a lot of warring in Asia between Japan and China. So this wasn't unique to the continent of Africa. It just so happened that I call it God, guns, and gold became the toxic mix. You know, when you were handing tribes their guns, they could go in and get those they could capture those enslaved persons a lot easier. And the gold was the motivation. You know, gold, by the way, that was in it was in the belly of the continent. But there were definitely, and then of course, you know, once Christianity was added, you got the psychological advantage in many ways. And that's not to say anything about Christianity itself. It's just, that's what happened. Yeah. And now you have yourself in a situation where once race became the construct in America to sustain that social order that needed slaves, then it came back to bite the people who were part of that unwittingly, you know, and they're not to be absolved, but it was not meant to be that way. And I can understand how, given what we were at that time in terms of humanity, how things could end up that way. But it took a unique brand of evil to come up with the brand of slavery that ended up, underpinning an entire economy for 4 centuries. I mean, that took a special kind of evil to make that happen, and then to continue to punish the offspring, Jim Crow, and all the other things that happened subsequent to that. But even today, arguably, that tells you something about how persistent this evil is.
It's about power. That's what most of these things boil down to. And I think we'll get a little bit off the history lesson, because I do want to get into the next question. Yeah. I do want to get into the next question of sort of the underfunding of research, but to the point of evil that you brought up, you know, fundamentally, when you look at history and you ask yourself a couple of questions that I asked myself, which is, we know humans evolved on the continent of Africa, and there was migration to different parts. So first thing I ask myself is, the people that believe themselves to be white, how come they ended up in a place like Europe with no resources? And, you know, not there are no resources, the resources there, but that's not, if you're going to pick a spot on the earth, like Europe isn't the spot to pick. It just, you know, rocks, caves, not a lot of greenery. And so the question was, you know, what caused that? And so my assumption, just think about humanity and how humans function, is there was a power struggle, and they weren't really the dominant force on Earth back then. And so I think with the suffering they experienced, the conflict they experienced in Europe, looking over there at Mansa Musa with his hordes of folks and piles of money, they're like, we want some of that. And so they planned, and they made their move. And so for me, when I look across the arc of history, I assume there have been several exchanges of power and a lot of evil and a lot of subjugation, like the Romans did to the British came and did it to us. And so I look at it as we as humanity got to figure out a step ahead of all of that, because the cycle is just evil, and it's not getting us anywhere any time soon that's going to be good. And it's just impacting so much else. And so my heart is that we could move to a future where we understand and appreciate what's happened historically. We're not allergic to the truth like people are today around critical race theory, but we can understand it so that we can actually build a better future. But if people are allergic to the truth, if they're ignoring the science and they just want to keep living, then we're not really heading anywhere. And that for me is where I land on all of this. Is we have to think about our kids, we have to think about the next generation and what we're leaving for them. But anyways, I'll get off my soapbox, and we can move to the next question, which is really around another slide that really talks about underfunding of research and structurally things that affect communities of color, things that affect women, things that affect veterans, somehow just don't get enough funding from NIH.
Yeah.
And certain things like aging and physical activity and even dietary supplement research seems to just get a whole lot more than certain things. And it just, I scratch my head a little bit. I'm like, what's going on here? So I'd love to get your reaction to this. I'll keep quiet for this whole segment and just let you and Yusuf kind of just have a conversation around what we're looking at.
Yeah. I'm gonna start with a real practical example that probably all three of us can relate to in terms of the purpose of research, which is really to solve a problem, right? I always wondered why when Black men enter the military, we all at some point, or most of us, at least in my experience, end up with real bad shaving problems. Yet we still get the same razors marketed to everybody else, nothing different, nothing. And I thought to myself, how much time is lost on that problem? Not just in terms of having to go to sick call. And at one point it got so bad for me that I was having really bad skin problems. And then I was a drill instructor for a while, and I would see all the recruits thrown in, right? They're all thrown into this common mix, but for some reason, it's just, it's like this, it's something as simple as shaving bumps. Why hasn't there been reason? You would think a razor company would have come in and then found a way to market to the masses of people with unique needs. But then what's crazy? Because I was also not just training recruits of color, I was training recruits who were white that also had shaving problems eventually. Now, it wasn't prevalent enough, I guess, in numbers to matter. But when you set systems up that ignore a few, it eventually comes back to hurt the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of that system. And I often cite the reality that white men have the highest rates of suicide in this country. Who has the lowest? Black women, right? And so when you deprioritized anybody, when you have laws that absolve police officers who shoot people illegally, you look at the numbers and you find that there are more white people that get shot by police officers per capita than any other race. You end up with these things that kind of come back to haunt you. And what's always been strange to me is why people see a benefit in not prioritizing things like sickle cell research within the Black community. Black people aren't the only ones who get sickle cell. People of other communities of color also have this issue. So there's almost a critical mass that's possible here to solve problems that affect everybody. But if you don't see everybody in that same, where humanity is the point, yeah, then you end up with people in power who look a certain way. But they also have other aspects of power, like property, like, just that our Congress is Exhibit A. You look at our Congress, and when they decide what gets researched, and they're going to do what's in service of their power. And so the further you move away from that, and the thing is about the military is there's such a lesson there, because it's the one place where you throw everybody in, and ideally it's driven by merit, right? You might be a white man. If you encounter a woman general with the stars on her collar, you don't stand up and show respect, no matter how you feel. If you want to participate in that experiment, in that social design, maybe that's why our best hope is research in the military. We need to look at Black women and the problems that face them specifically, because it'll benefit all women on some level if we do that. But until we're at the table, we'll be on the menu for the most part. And I want to see us be at the table. And I think that's where I go back to the point you push back on, where we're talking about participation. As a layperson, I want to see, even in affluent areas where communities of color, comprise the community, there should be more engagement, but there should also be active outreach to research communities. Have them, compel them to come in, compel your legislatures to do the work of including communities of color in research that they authorize at the congressional level. And that requires getting educated about how it works. That requires knowing people like you. And, we shouldn't be looking at people like you and Yusuf like unicorns. Like, you hear somebody say a Black engineer or a Black scientist, it's not been my experience that's uncommon, because I seek it out. I find people that do that. But when it thins out when you're not paying attention to it. And I think people have been living their lives. COVID is an example. COVID is a prime example. We have no idea how this virus is going to impact communities of color, not because of their color, but because of the conditions that they tend to find themselves in, the food insecurity and all the other things. We're going to find out, did it have a different impact? But we have to be a part of that, and we have to insist on being a part of that. Now, I'm hearing conversations happening about that, but we're still moving on with our lives. I'm interested in knowing, for my child's sake, how is this going to impact him, when he's older? And so I'm seeking it out, and I hope more communities seek it out rather than wait to be asked.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've touched on a lot of key points, and I think, what I would add to that is the literacy piece, man. Health literacy for our community is just non-existent, and so that's what Indigenous health wants to start as the core, because until we're educated around this, there's just going to be this naivete around it. And unfortunately, we're the ones, you look at this list, that's a lot of the mortality rates that's affecting us. I think, what COVID did, which is what got me galvanized I had to do something, right? I think what you mentioned is you start looking around, we're all isolated, and it's like, well, somebody's going to have to do something. And then you look around that, you're like, well, I might have to be part of the solution. Because as you said, there's not many of us that has, gone through some of the experiences that we've had and been in some of the rooms. And so when you look at Indigenous, pitch deck, each individual, they were carefully hand selected, but have that, the juice behind them to kind of really step up and have that type of dialogue and be taken credibly. Not only in our community, but in these institutions where we're not represented. And so, that's probably the best thing that COVID has been able to provide for me, was giving me that insight to say, look, there is a point of history where you're gonna be asked, what did you do?
Right.
Just like with anything else. what did you do, right? Not what everybody else did. What did you do when you knew this and you understood that our people were dying at a higher rate? Our women to maternal mortality rates are high. Babies born to African-American women have a larger survival rate. So all these things just started to pile up, and it just moved me again. We go back to what we started this conversation. Got to be able to move and be able to move others to kind of, get this thing going. And so fortunate for me, I've had the ability to kind of get, a team together that really could address this issue from a, policy standpoint, a veteran standpoint, women standpoint, because all of those are all different verticals that have probably 8 or 9 different issues that's going to be needed to address. And it's going to take a village. But I think, when we started to look on where do we start first, the literacy around our community, which is kind of odd, right? We have all these cell phones and we have all of this education on your phone. But when it comes to certain things like health, it seems like it might be on a different server.
Well, because it's also but it's the algorithm that gets you to that information.
Absolutely.
If you don't prioritize, health for people of color, you're going to see, pop-ups that want to sell you something, not ones that are going to invite you to participate. Can you imagine if more people had pop-ups that invited them to participate in clinical trials based on an algorithm that associates your life, maybe as a person of color, with certain activities, with certain geographies, with certain aspects of living? They know a lot about us in other ways. But if you could ascertain all the indicators of all the determinants of health in an algorithm that then leads you to these opportunities that you weren't looking for, but now that you see them, you may consider them. Imagine that kind of world.
And that's exactly where, again, with the insights we have of the team and the expertise, that's where we're going.
Yep.
We now have to be deliberate. I think where we were before, we were like, well, yeah, they'll get the pamphlet and the information somewhere. We now have to be intentional. And that's what Indigenous Health is doing. We're that same philosophy you just brought up, we're gonna boil that down and make that into something actionable, where, you as an individual, we're gonna feed you that information on a daily basis to where, again, you just can't just ignore it anymore, right? This is what the different disease areas based on your family history that's gonna, start to affect your community and your family and your kids, and your wife and your daughters. And I think, with the healthcare scare with COVID, we may have probably the most poignant moment in time to get our folks, Black and brown people's attention. And I'll let Michael kind of chime in.
No, thank you, Yusuf and Sherman. You brought up amazing points. So the final piece I'll just put out is fundamentally, when we look at this chart, it's really about resource allocation. And I think part of the reason Black Lives Matter became a chant was because if everyone believed that it did, the chant wouldn't need to exist. Mm-hmm. When you look at the institutions and how they allocate resources, they say, show me where you spend your money and I'll tell you what you care about. Mm-hmm. And so we're looking at where they're spending the money, and it's like, hey, how come violence against women isn't a priority for NIH when we know the kind of harm that comes from that, either in domestic relationships or others? Why isn't maternal mortality, where, Black women are 4 times more likely to die than white women during childbirth? Why is that not a priority? Hypertension. Hypertension as a cause of death is over 500,000 Americans every year. And that's also the foundation for things like chronic kidney disease and diabetes that disproportionately affects Black and brown people. And so you're like, why is that not a funding priority? And then it's not even in a vacuum. It's like right there. And they're like, they're spending more on dietary supplements research than hypertension. Really? Who made that call? And so this is where the frustration comes, because for me, my drive to this wasn't just seeing how many people were dying in our communities from COVID, or seeing George Floyd be killed on camera. It was really just all of that bottling up. And then I had lost 2 friends to sickle cell. And that just got me to a point of, I've been hearing about sickle cell since I was a kid. Why is there no progress? Then I look at how much they're spending. I'm like, if you don't fund the research, it's a pipeline thing. I mean, if you spend this little on research, this much is going to come out of it in therapeutics. It kind of goes hand in hand. And I'm not a fan of incrementalism, because I want to like solve this and move on. So I'm not trying to say, hey, Congress, how do we make the 145 200? No, it's how do we make the 145 $1 billion? Because if you don't spend that kind of money, you're not going to get to the outcomes. And I would look over to the left and say, maybe we take some of that aging research money and put it towards some sickle cell research. Because guess what? Aging, I can tell you how that research goes. We're going to age. We're going to die.
Mm-hmm. Number 1 cause of death, right? Age.
just it's natural cause.
I think the one, the one great thing about living in a democratic republic is the pendulum swings, right? And we see it. We saw it with all the ways that history has evolved. And you got to catch it at the top of the swing. I mean, being about that life means you're willing to fight in one of 3 or maybe all 3 arenas. One is in them streets, protest, right? The other is in the courts. And the third is on Capitol Hill through lobbying and getting laws changed. And if you're not about the life of promoting social justice, even on your own behalf, then you can't complain about it. Not you specifically, but folks can't. You can't get mad at people who demand more from their government than you do. And they get it. There's going to be another side. There's going to be a counter to everything you do for yourself. There's going to be a counter, and they're relentless. And sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. And when they lose, you got to make sure they lose big. So when you had George Floyd died and every corporation in the country, to include the NFL, wanted to throw money at the problem, you saw PSAs and you saw scholarships and programs, but you didn't see a lot of people demanding research. And that's the pendulum was at the high point. And those of us in the know knew it wasn't going to stay there. For every Reconstruction, you got a Jim Crow. For every civil rights, you got a crack era, Reaganomics and all those things. And then for every Obama, you got a Trump. And then you got a Biden. And then you get whatever you get. So when the pendulum swings at that high point, we got to be about that life. I tell people you can't change the government, but you can change your relationship to it. You can change how it sees you, right? You don't have to be an elected official to matter, but you got to elect in to officially matter when it counts. And right now that pendulum is kind of going the other way. Well, we can slow it down, but we got to have people scare those congressional staffers by ringing their phones off the hook and say, look, in my community, they have a lot of people dying from this condition. What's going on with the water, or what's going on with all the other indicators that something isn't right? But instead, we're focusing on, what Dave Chappelle said and who's wearing what on the red carpet and all those things, and mottos and memes and all those things. It can't, and I'm not saying that about, it's not the entirety. But what I see mattering more to people are not the things like this, and we have to make it matter more. While this pendulum is where it is before it changes, and it will change.
I'd say the things that are promoted, right? So there's this thing, I think it was Eisenhower that talked about it initially, called it the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. So you take the military out, you find out there are a lot of industrial complexes that are designed to keep things the way they are. The media is a part of that. And so when you see all the things you mentioned, it's because there's some conversations happening that says this is what needs to be promoted. And so part of why we're building sort of our content and really having these conversations is so that we can hopefully create enough of it to then use that to engage our communities and really just bring the things that we think are important to the forefront. Because it wasn't so much that, people didn't want meaningful change. It's that, George Floyd was murdered on camera. It was almost like, when, John Lewis and folks are crossing the, Edmund.
Tennis bridge, yeah.
Yeah. And ultimately, because it was caught on camera and because they saw the brutality that was inflicted upon a people, the world was moved and people were moved to finally try and do something about it. And so people galvanized and thought the murder of George Floyd, watching one man kneel on another man's neck for almost 10 minutes till he died, was going to be that moment. And what we saw was a lot of PR, like you said. We haven't seen legislation come out, that says, here is the way we're going to do policing differently. On the voting side, what we've seen is actually a lot of protests about voting and voting rights and how we should make it better. But what we've actually seen legislatively is a lot more voter suppression. And so this dynamic we're in right now in this democratic republic of ours is an interesting one. And we'll
point out something on the point you just made before I forget, though.
Yes.
But the connection that's missed on top of everything you said is we were also in a pandemic.
Yes.
While we were talking about voting and talking about all the other things, that also would have been the time to say, by the way, our health is important to us too.
Yes.
Black health matters.
Yes.
Right? I would have loved to have seen that be a part of the discussion, but it wasn't. It was about all the other things that are indicators of living and well-being, but not really about well-being. And so that's a pandemic, for God's sakes. And we were still talking about whether Black people are impacted by vaccines differently. But those weren't the conversations we were seeing corporations have. We weren't seeing a lot of that. We were seeing a lot of inclusion, a lot of brown faces being included. You had every superhero suddenly became a brown person. But the investment in health would have been more attainable. Voting was, that's one of those things, but certainly. And there may have been some investment, but we didn't see enough of it to be satisfied that in that moment when there was also a pandemic, wow, that time on George Floyd's neck was ticking away. That to me is an indication of what not just our society prioritizes, but whether we prioritize it enough for ourselves to catch it at the top of that pendulum swing.
You made a lot of fantastic points, Sherman. This has been an amazing conversation, and this is why we're so excited to have you as a member of our Impact Advisory Board as we take on this mission to speak truth to power, to figure out how to get our people involved with their health, to figure out how we get some more funding to invest in research for conditions primarily affecting Black and brown people, women, and veterans, because someone's got to do something.